Hello and welcome to Ratio Christi Television. To be or not to be. Today we're talking about the roles of doctors in suicide. Ratio Christi is a campus apologetics alliance. We set up Christian apologetics clubs on university, college, and community college campuses throughout the United States and internationally as well. However, we're not just reaching college students. A few years ago, we started Ratio Christi College Prep, which is a high school level of Ratio Christi training for students to prepare them for what they will face in college once they get there. 50 to 80% of church-going youth leave the church after high school or by the time they're 22 years old. Now you don't have to wait for your child or grandchild to get to college in order to get some apologetics on their very own school campus. They can do this through Ratio Christi College Prep. Just go to ratiochristi.org, go to the top, click on the RCCP icon, and you can find out more about that. The purpose of our organization is to help make people aware of the evidence for the Christian worldview and to help make people understand truth with a capital T, which is why we call our program Truth Matters. Joining me is Reverend Thomas McCuddy. Thomas is a native of Memphis, Tennessee, and currently lives in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Thomas is a graduate of Middle Tennessee State University, where he earned a bachelor's in mathematics. He earned a master's of arts in biblical studies from Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he's currently pursuing a doctorate of ministry in apologetics. Thomas served in pastoral roles in the church for over 15 years before recently transitioning into the full-time role of director of the Norm Geisler Institute for the Norm Geisler International Ministries. Thomas is also the head of the apologetics department at Carolina College of Biblical Studies in Fayetteville, where he also teaches Christian ethics. Through all this, Thomas seeks to disciple the body of Christ by equipping believers to defend their faith and live their faith with passion and conviction. He's been here once before. Thomas, welcome back to Truth Matters.
Thank you, Tony. I'm glad to be back.
Thomas, it's great to have you here for this always timely topic. This is a topic that a lot of people still don't even know what it is, but those who do are commonly trying to make a case for life if it's coming from a Christian. But of course, from non-believers out there, they make a case for this and saying, well, it's completely fine, and this is why, although they don't give any real good evidence for that. It's usually just an empty assertion. But what is the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide?
Well, basically, the difference is on who's causing the death. So if the doctor is actually causing the death, then this is euthanasia. That's what we mean when we say the person has been euthanized. But if the doctor is passively assisting the patient, such as just handing the medicine to the patient, but the patient is the one actually taking, we should call it medicine, taking the pills that would cause death, then the person is committing suicide. So the difference is whether it's a suicide that's been helped or a doctor who is performing death in the case of euthanasia.
Now, people often refer to this as death with dignity. Can you explain the idea behind this so-called saying or this so-called name that we give it?
Right. It's more of a label that's used to kind of soften what's actually happening. And oftentimes it's related to the case you imagine somebody who is wasting away in a hospital bed, and they view that as an undignified way to die. So through euthanasia and assisted suicide, they can reclassify this as a dignified way to die. And in fact, the same wording was used in the case of the little boy Charlie in England. And if you remember, Tony, this was a boy who was diagnosed with a rare condition. And the only hope was bringing him into the United States for a treatment that had little possibility of success, but it still had a possibility. It was very experimental. And so the hospital said it was better for the child to die with dignity there in the hospital rather than taking the risk on this procedure to save his life. Now, I admit I don't know the likelihood of success, but let's say it was a 1%. That's pretty low success rate. And the question we ask is, as parents, what would we do to save our child? And even though the bill was paid for by others, so it wasn't a monetary issue, there was nothing stopping the child from being transported to the United States except for the idea of the hospital that this child should die with dignity. and things got hung up in court until it was a 0% chance that he would survive. So I believe that the death with dignity term is a rather loose term as it's used in this debate.
Thomas, as you know, you will hear people say, well, euthanasia and assisted suicide will actually alleviate the suffering of people, and suffering isn't good. So if either one of these options work well in getting rid of the suffering, well, no suffering is better than any suffering at all. So what's the problem here?
Well, I would challenge that assumption, number one, and also I would say that hospitals do have ways of alleviating suffering through medical treatments and through pain medicine, not death. Death is not the alleviation of suffering. Death is the ending of life. So we got to remember that suicide, and this is why so much in the culture, you see it on Facebook, you see it around, suicide is not the option when you're suffering, either emotionally or physically. So hospitals, really, they can do four things. They can heal a patient. They can allow death to occur by stopping treatment, and patients sometimes will opt for this. Or they could prolong death, and this is what usually we see with the machines, in which people really don't want to be hooked up to the machines and be vegetables. And the fourth thing they could do is hasten death, which is the assisted suicide and euthanasia. And the first two, healing and even just stopping treatments in the event of terminal cases, these are natural and good. The third option, the machine, and as a pastor, I've been to a number of times where people were unhooked from the machine and were allowed to die. And within a very few minutes, the person passed away right there, surrounded by the family. But this fourth option of hastening death, killing a person, this is not what doctors should do. This is not, and the issue that revolves around this is making this public policy. I would like to note that suicide is not technically illegal. It's not something that can be prosecuted. But this idea that doctors should have the ability and we should condone the suicide and the killing of people in hospitals, that's what this is really about.
Now, a lot of people say that if a person has a terminal illness or they're in some type of pain, or a lot of pain, even if, say, the hospital or the doctor is able to give them pain medication and all of that, if they have a terminal illness, then, if the surviving family members or whoever else, or I shouldn't say surviving, because the person who's sick is still alive too, but I'm saying the people who are just fine, quote unquote, are saying, well, we don't want them to live this way, and if we don't end their life through one of these different procedures that you're talking about, well, then we are forcing he or she to stay alive, and we don't think that they would want that, especially if there's something that happened where they can't communicate themselves or even write or whatever to communicate. But you have these family members who are saying, well, we don't want to force them to live like this, and let's just end it right now. And these people will ask, well, what's wrong here is that we're forcing them to stay alive when we shouldn't do that. What's your response to someone who comes from that specific angle?
Well, the notion of forcing someone to stay alive, this is something I've heard many times, and I really want to think about what those words are when we say that, when we're forcing someone to stay alive. Life is something that's precious. Life is something that we only get one of, contrary to reincarnated opinions. And when it comes to someone who faces those terminal illnesses, the idea is the concept of killing them to end their life prematurely through what they're going through. This is the idea is that the hospital is not forcing them to stay alive. We're supposed to protect life. We're supposed to help people and alleviate suffering. And again, I would draw the distinction that that's not what we're doing when we are killing the person. And in the event that if you have somebody who is not responsive, much like if they were, and again, as I've seen people who are on machines, unplugging the person from the machine and allowing them to die naturally, this is very different from euthanizing and assisted suicide. There was a case, and I can't remember her name, but many years ago, it was a husband, and this was the situation where the wife was, cognitively, she wasn't able to communicate. There was some sort of brain damage, and the husband wanted to take her off life support, was the idea. Well, what was keeping her alive was a feeding tube. So
Mhm.
allowing someone to starve to death is not the same thing as when we take them off a machine that is helping them to breathe and keeping their blood flowing. When it comes to keeping people alive, that's what hospitals do. And if a person does not want to stay alive because of a terminal illness, they can see that through, and like I said, not even from a Christian standpoint, just from a general public policy, the idea of promoting suicide, that, oh, if it's just gotten bad for you, just remember, you can always kill yourself. There should be something that resonates within our hearts, no matter your belief system, that this is not the kind of public policy, and that's not what we're doing. It's not the forcing to stay alive, it's the protection of life and the easing of suffering for as long as we may live. So I think that, again, the way that the question is all often stated, forcing someone to stay alive, which I've seen a number of times, I think is loading the question down with things that really aren't there.
Well, I only have one guess on who you're talking about, so I'm going to go all in on naming Terri Schiavo. Is that the lady you're talking about?
Terri Schiavo, thank you, yes.
And if I recall here correctly, it was her husband who wanted to end her life, and I believe her parents who wanted to keep her alive. And if I recall correctly, this went to court, and they're like battling out in court, trying to figure out like, hey, who is in the right here? I'm her husband, so I
Mm-hmm.
have that major relationship more than her parents, and her parents are like, well, no, we're her parents, and I think this too is how if I'm uh, thinking correctly here, about like the living will and different
Mm-hmm.
documents that have maybe come out since then, of people saying, okay, if something happens to me and I'm in some kind of situation where I can't talk, I can't write, I have no communication, but I'm alive, then this is what I want to happen to me, because you have, okay,
Right.
well, you have the husband, you have the parents, and fighting over, you know, this woman who sadly was in the middle of all this and couldn't communicate at all. So a very sad situation here. And
And that's the
in
nature of the do not resuscitate order. And again, as a pastor, I have members right now who have those standing orders that if something happens to them, that if their heart stops, they have it in writing that they are not to be resuscitated. But allowing death to occur naturally is different from forcing it on someone. In the case of her husband, one of the issues that he was citing is that, well, as long as she's alive, he can't divorce her, he can't move on. And so, yeah, they did face a very difficult situation where the parents are saying, we want our daughter to live, and the husband is saying, I want my wife to die. So we realize, well, what is more important, the protecting of life or killing someone? And so that's why even this is beyond kind of a religious issue. This isn't just from a Christian perspective. This is just from a general. We should, as humans, protect and cherish the life that we have.
Now, what is the track record with euthanasia and assisted suicide?
Well, again, many people like to focus and say, well, and they give the worst case scenario, somebody who's laying in the hospital bed and we're alleviating suffering, and people who want to take that option. But according to the Oregon Public Health Division, because this is legal in Oregon, 90% of people who choose to die do so because of some loss of activity or ability that makes life enjoyable. Pain is the least cited concern. So, really, what we're looking at is about 9 out of 10 patients want to be killed or kill themselves because they're not going to be able to live the way that they want to. So this isn't about, this issue many times is not about uh, some sort of humanitarian helping someone out. This is about people who are saying, well, if I don't get to live the kind of life I want to, then I just want to die. And again, from public policy standpoint, this is where we do so many campaigns and try to share, suicide is not the option. This is not what we want to promote. And but in the case of those extreme cases, terminal cases, some people might say, well, in terms of the end result, whether or not they do euthanization or the assisted suicide, the end result is the same. And I would say that's correct. The end result will happen, but the means does make a difference. And if we're going to legislate that it is okay, that it is acceptable, that it is good to kill people who are in these situations, or to help them kill themselves, I think that this is a dangerous situation. And even in the case of some of those who've tried the assisted suicide, there's cases where it didn't work. Like there was adverse reactions and even more suffering in the process. So it's not a clear cut, oh, if you just do this thing, then you'll just slide into this nice, comfortable sleep and that's it. That's not always what happens. And I don't think the public is aware that of some of the suffering and pain that euthanization and the assisted suicide has caused people.
This is a good point too, and I do want to recommend a resource for our viewers. I have a couple of questions still for you, of course, but I want to recommend to our viewers a book which you may have read as well, Thomas. It's called Ethics for a Brave New World, but this is by the Feinberg brothers, John and Paul Feinberg. Yes. This has it's a book probably this thick. I mean, it probably has 800-900 pages, but it does have at least a couple of pretty long chapters on assisted suicide, if I recall correctly. And it goes into all these different things that we're talking about, way more than we can present in this episode. But like active euthanasia and passive euthanasia and administering something versus, like you said, taking out the feeding tube. All this stuff is talked about, and they make a great case for life in this book as well. But Thomas, what is really wrong with allowing people to choose death? I mean, what's the bottom line issue for people when they just they're willing to accept a reasonable answer? And just that, of course, as you know, a lot of Christians, unfortunately, can't do apologetics or give a case for life and really explain this. So for people who say, hey, I will take a reasonable answer, what is the bottom line issue here?
Well, again, as I stated before, suicide is not illegal. But again, even the idea that if I was to sit here and try to say, well, hey, you can always just kill yourself on your own, there's something about the human nature that says, okay, that's not what you should be doing. This is not the answer. This is not the good way to go about this. And the bottom line issue is what we're talking about is making public policy in terms of what we condone, what we accept, and what we promote. And it's not a slippery slope. It's the next logical step that as we offer this to people to say, all right, there's an option. You can check the box if you would like to be euthanized or assisted suicide, that if we normalize this and promote this, eventually that this will be implemented as regular health care. And just imagine, as we're trying to categorize these things, that euthanasia would fall under health care. Because the problem we have is that we're causing death, and causing death is not health care. And just imagine going into an emergency room and down the road, and especially with cash-strapped hospitals, and as much as we talk about the rising cost of health care, how the next logical step is, well, in an emergency room, that there's a standing order. Any person who has 50% chance of survival or less should be allowed to die on the table. We realize life is worth saving, and where you draw that line. How do you, especially in case, like I said, with the emergency room cases, and this is why in this topic, and why I'm rather passionate about it, is because I'm rather influenced by this as a pastor, seeing this and watching so many people fight for life. And many times they succeed where there was such a little chance. So promoting this as an option, I think would end lives that didn't necessarily need to end. That if a person dies, you can't stop death. We ought not to promote death as healthcare.
Now, some people may be watching this and thinking, well, okay, you're giving us these answers and stuff, but hey, you've never been in my shoes. You don't really know what this is like in the real world. You're just a guy on TV giving answers to this stuff from a Christian perspective. Thomas, have you personally known anyone who's been or faced a terminal situation, and what have you experienced personally?
Well, again, as a pastor, I've experienced this in a number of different ways. Everything from as I get to know people, and in the case of one church member who was telling me about a family member who had, I think, esophageal cancer, and they were going to basically have to put in something like a pipe in order to replace his esophagus. And so she tells me that really the only thing that would affect him in life, they told him, you would never be able to tie your shoes again. And he said, that's no way to live, and he chose to die. Now, that was not euthanasia. That was not assisted suicide. He just chose to allow the cancer to take his life, and he died some months later. And so in hearing real life people like this, they can choose that. And there's something about us, and in hearing the story, I think, isn't this a waste of life? Isn't there a better option? Shouldn't we be promoting life and be promoting that good? And so I hear a number of stories like that, but very personally, as a pastor, and it was just less than a year ago, I had a church member who had esophageal cancer. And I remember when he got the diagnosis. I remember as he began treatments, and every time I would go see him, I'd ask him how he's doing. Oh, I'm good, Pastor, I'm good. And sometimes he got great news from the doctor, sometimes he got bad news. And eventually the news came that there was no more chemo could do, it was inoperable, and they basically gave him a timeline. And I went to go see him, and I asked him, how are you doing? He says, I'm good, Pastor, I'm good. And I remember when he went to hospice, and I remember when he was lying in the hospice bed, and he was struggling for life, and he was on the pain meds, and he was, just preparing to die. And I remember I was going out of the country, and I was knew that he only had days, and I went to him, and I asked him, I said, how are you doing? And he said, as very raspy, he said, I'm good, Pastor, I'm good. And I told him, and again, from the Christian perspective, I said, this is not goodbye. This is see you later. And he said he knew, and I knew I wouldn't see him again. I knew that eventually, that the cancer would take him. And what I said, I actually got to write in kind of a eulogy to the family. And what I sent them is I said, as a pastor, I taught this man how to live. But this man taught me how to die. And it's a lesson I'll never forget. That as I watched him, as I watched him fight, and he said, I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up. Even there at the end, laying in the hospital bed, he's like, I'm not giving up. He says, this cancer has to kill me. I'm not giving up. That's what a life well lived looks like to the end. That's what we need to promote. That is, having seen it, having watched the pain, and the family as well afterwards. Does it hurt? Yes, it hurts when you're losing a loved one. It hurts when you get that diagnosis. It hurts knowing there's nothing you can do. But to end well, to cherish life and the time that you have, this is what the doctors should promote. This is what our legislation should promote. This is what we as a society should promote, is the value of life. And I've seen it for myself, and I will never forget all my days watching this man fight all the way to the end, and I will cherish that. And that is something that I think the reason why when we look at euthanasia and assisted suicide, that's not a treatment. That's not an answer.
Thomas, God is sovereign. If he wants someone dead, they will be. There's no reason for us to go out on our own to end our life. If we're still alive, that's by the grace of God. I mean, we're all sinners. We're in need of a Savior. And whether we know Christ or not, if we're breathing, I mean, it's another day to make him known and to share the gospel with people. I've known people as well who've had terminal illnesses, and guess what? This was their topic to start conversations with people about the fact that we're all going to die someday, and where will you end up when you die? And it was a great way to segue from the natural to the spiritual. No one has death written on their calendar, yet 150,000 people die every single day. If you are alive, and especially if you are a Christian, if you know the Lord, if you repent and put your trust in Christ, you can use all the days the Lord gives you. You can redeem the time and make him known and to glorify him. And just as you had said here, Thomas, not just glorifying him in our life, but glorifying him in our death. And that would be doing all that we can for him until he calls us home. Against our will of wanting to live, he calls us home. So this is something that we need to factor in to this situation here. It's been a huge blessing to have you here to give all these great answers to people. I know that it's hit home with a lot of people, and especially too just the fact that you have been through these situations yourself, and of course with that great testimony of this man who knew, well, to live as Christ and to die as gain, but I'm not going to go any sooner than he takes me. So thank you so much for being here on Truth Matters once again, and letting our audience know some good answers to this vital topic that at some point they're probably going to have a conversation about with someone who they know, coworker, family member, friend, etc. So thank you so much for being on once again.
Thank you, Tony.
Friends, when we look at the available evidence, we find that the Christian worldview aligns with reality. We need to think about this topic. We need to think about life. We need to think about death and how these intertwine. And as we as Christians, with our goal of sharing the gospel with people and defending the historic Christian faith, all of these topics that we talk about on Truth Matters, including this one, a matter of life and death by choice, is something that we need to be equipped to talk to people about. So please go to ratiochristi.org to find out more. Please find out if there is a Ratio Christi chapter in your area, whether it's a high school level, community college, or university. If there's not, well, then we need to get one set up as soon as possible. We need people who can be chapter directors. Those are the trainers for the students. Usually it's a person who has a master's degree in Christian apologetics or philosophy or related field. Also, we need student leaders. If you are a student on campus, well, that's one of the 3 roles that need to be filled if we're at the community college level on up. And of course, we need a faculty advisor as a 3rd role to fill these clubs and make them happen as well. Of course, the high school level, a little lower level in that we only need a mentor, but we need people to do that as well. Please check out our website, pray for Ratio Christi, support it financially, and that will allow this vital work to continue. And remember, when it comes to what we believe and why we believe it, truth matters.